We begin with breaking news this hour as Israel's military saying it's resumed operations in the Gaza Strip, just minutes after a 7-day pause in fighting ended. The temporary ceasefire expired at 7 a.m. local time, but negotiators failed to agree a further extension that would have secured the release of more Hamas-held hostages. Israel said it resumed combat after the militant group violated the terms of the truce. There's been no immediate comment from Hamas, which is considered a terrorist organisation by the US and the EU. We're joined now by DW correspondent Ben Fajzullin in Jerusalem. Ben, Israel's military says it has resumed combat operations in the Gaza Strip. Do we know any more detail at this point?
It confirmed exactly that, Anthony. 30 minutes after the truce had run out, we were expecting a possible extension of that truce, but that hasn't happened. It said that, or rather we saw videos on social media, smoke billowing from Jabalia refugee camp in the north, also journalists reporting artillery fire in Gaza City and drones seen in the south of the Gaza Strip, as well as a house in Rafah being targeted and many wounded, according to reports. This is the first time in 7 days that we've seen fighting. There'd been sporadic rocket fire, tank fire and artillery fire, but this now sounds like the war is back on in full force, to use the words of the Israelis.
Netanyahu's office confirmed the resumption of fighting, as you say, saying Israel is committed to achieve its targets in the war. What exactly are those targets?
The targets haven't changed. To release all of the hostages, to ensure that Gaza no longer poses a threat to the civilians of Israel, and that Hamas is dismantled. Over this 7-day pause, we'd seen over 100 hostages released, 240 Palestinian prisoners in return, and more aid getting into the civilians, remembering that some reported 15,000 civilians have died in the fighting in Gaza, including Hamas fighters and other combatants. Some 1.7 million people having been displaced, mainly from the north to the south. Remembering that Israel had made it clear if this truce, or when this truce is over, it will concentrate its operation on the south of the Gaza Strip, hence the warnings from the US to be more precise in its targets, because so many civilians have been caught up in the crossfire. And those civilians now expected to move to the north. What's left in the north, much of it is a wasteland, according to reports and the pictures we've seen, and the small areas that have been set up as safe areas in the south, according to groups, humanitarian groups, way too small to house all of these displaced people.
Another thing Benjamin Netanyahu said was that Hamas failed to agree on the release of further hostages. You've reported extensively in this space since you've been in Jerusalem. Where does a resumption of fighting leave efforts to negotiate further releases?
Well, according to Israel, its resumption of fighting will only put more pressure on Hamas to release those hostages. The hard part, though, is for Hamas is finding those hostages. According to reports we're receiving this morning, that it was finding it difficult to find the rest of the women. According to Israel, the terms were all of the women would be released by today. A list coming last minute, according to reports, and Israel not happy with that. The other part of the problem here is that Hamas fired rockets towards Israeli civilians, according to Israel, early this morning in the last hour before the truce, and in just the minutes before the truce ended and minutes afterwards, there were more sirens going off in southern Israel, more rocket alerts. Also Hamas refusing to give any sort of explanation, refusing to take responsibility. So a lot of uncertainty this morning as to exactly what's gone wrong with those ceasefire negotiations and the negotiations to extend the ceasefire.
DW correspondent Ben Fajzullin in Jerusalem. Thank you. Well, Hazem Balousha is a journalist from Gaza who was able to escape to the Jordanian capital Amman in the early days of this conflict. We welcome him now. Hazem, Israel says it has resumed its military operation. What are you hearing from Gaza? What are Gazans going through in the early stages of this resumption in fighting?
Yeah, since the time of the ending the ceasefire or the pause, the airstrikes continued, clashes reported from different areas, whether from the north, from the east of Jordanian in the middle area, even in the south. Many airstrikes took place, artillery shells here from different places. According to the medical officials in Gaza, many casualties are reported, whether from Khan Yunis or Rafah or even from Gaza City.
Israel accused Hamas of firing rockets from northern Gaza this morning. Hazem, can we confirm that?
Well, it's not easy to confirm any party statement on this regard. Nobody is close to the fighting front line. Israel accused Hamas. Hamas didn't admit this. It could be happening, but we don't know. Nobody on the ground can confirm or deny this. This is a combating area. Anybody approaching it would be shot. Many incidents happened before, but Palestinians approached some areas to check their houses and they were shot.
Tell us about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, Hazem. Has it noticeably improved during the week-long pause in fighting that brought us to this point?
If we compare it between before the pause and after, of course, there is a little bit of improvement, but whether it's enough or not, it's not. According to the ordinary people, there are shortages of everything, of food, of water, no electricity, telecommunication is very poor, access to the areas is limited. People are suffering from finding basic needs like cooking gas. Lines are still there. People are taking long time of recharging their devices, mobile phones to be connected. Items of food that entering are like it's very limited, cans and some medical supplies as well. Whereas the access to the water is very hard as well.
So as they fight for daily necessities, the Israeli military has called on Palestinians to stay in southern Gaza. How safe do they feel there?
If we talk about today, more airstrikes happen in the south than the north. There was airstrike reported in Rafah city. It's the southern city of Gaza Strip. One in Khan Yunis, about 200 meters away from Nasser Hospital, according to a colleague there. There was another strike in Maghazi, east of central area. Many casualties were reported there. So people believe like there is no complete safe place in across the Gaza Strip.
Journalist Hazem Balousha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, as Israel resumes operations against Hamas militants, international pressure is growing to do more to protect civilian lives. According to the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, 15,000 Palestinians have been killed in the 8-week conflict.
I made clear that before Israel resumes major military operations, it must put in place humanitarian civilian protection plans that minimize further casualties of innocent Palestinians. That means taking more effective steps to protect the lives of civilians, including by clearly and precisely designating areas and places in southern and central Gaza where they can be safe and out of the line of fire. It means avoiding further significant displacement of civilians inside of Gaza. It means avoiding damage to life-critical infrastructure, like hospitals, like power stations, like water facilities. And it means giving civilians who've been displaced to southern Gaza the choice to return to the north as soon as conditions permit. There must be no enduring internal displacement.
Well, for more, let's cross over to military expert Frank Ledwidge, who's in Oxford. Frank, is what the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken calls for feasible from a military perspective in such a tight area?
Well, if I was advising the IDF, which fortunately for them I am not, I would suggest that a safe area for civilians might also constitute a safe area for the remnants, such as it is of Hamas. I can't imagine the Israeli military are very keen on this idea for very good reasons. And of course, they're not the only ones. Right on the other side of the spectrum, Egypt has said that it doesn't like them because it sees them as a precursor to expulsion, in other words, gathering people in one place to be moved about. And humanitarians, rather more reasonably, say, look, you can't crowd people in areas like that without proper supplies, food, medical facilities and so forth, and expect them to survive. And this is supported again by the World Health Organization for slightly different, although very closely connected reasons of public health. It's a very tall order, this. And but to round back to the military issue, a safe zone for civilians, Hamas's major defensive weapon, of course, is the civilian population, and they will use that.
Gaza City, then, has already been hit particularly hard, as we've seen over and over. What more is there to achieve for the Israeli military that has already been achieved in its war against Hamas? Where might Israel's focus be from this point on?
Well, Anthony, they haven't finished dealing with or clearing the northern part of Gaza yet. In fact, my take on the maps that are available, they're probably about one-third the way through there. And they've found in that time 400 tunnels. They've killed probably hundreds, maybe thousands of Hamas activists, and they will continue to do so. I suspect, by the way, that the rate of civilian casualties, thankfully, will go down, partly as a result of Blinken's intervention. But back to what they have yet to do. It's a token, I think, of how much there is to do, that none of the three major targets, Isa, Ta'if, and above all Shinwari, have yet been killed or indeed captured. And I think those would be major targets for the Israelis as individuals. And as we will no doubt see, Hamas still will retain some coherence as a military force. We'll see what the extent of that over the next few days. No, there's plenty for the Israelis to do. Secretary of State Blinken's concern is that whilst the Israeli Defense Forces seem to be planning for an operation for months, he says, look, politically, you've got weeks. And for them to achieve their objectives in that time will be really difficult, I think.
Is there any way of knowing, Frank, how much of a threat Hamas still poses to the better equipped Israeli military at this point? How much capability does Hamas still have?
Well, I think what the Israelis would say, considerable, and we will know when the Israelis think that they have achieved their objectives, when they say so, and when the operation rounds and grinds to a close, and we're nowhere near that. I mean, the first thing that happened this morning was a rocket attack, which seems to have breached the ceasefire and caused the resumption of hostilities. We note, by the way, earlier in the week, Hamas still retains a significant terrorist capability within Israel, as well as a huge terrorist capability within Gaza, having killed at a bus stop three civilians. I've no doubt at all that Hamas is still a going concern, and so are the other groups alongside it. And of course, let's not forget as well, the remaining 150 or so, perhaps even more, depending on whether we can believe how many are still alive, according to Hamas, still within Gaza. There's so much for the Israelis yet to do.
You refer to the fragility of the truce, Frank. How hard is it going to be to achieve another truce? What does history teach us about breaking a truce and then achieving a pause in fighting again?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question. And we have to remember here that the people involved in this on all sides are really gritty, pragmatic, let's say, if we can call them that, pragmatic individuals. You've got Mossad on the one side and the Hamas leadership safely ensconced there in Qatar on the other, as well as Americans, Qataris, to some extent other actors too. And these are realists. And it may well be that both sides may calculate at some point in the future, just as they did last week, that the stars are aligned for another ceasefire, possibly for humanitarian reasons, possibly to release more hostages and exchange more prisoners. Now, I've little doubt that this could be repeated. And I think we may well see that, but we're casting ahead into the future. There's so many contingencies. Very difficult to say, obviously.
Great to get your insight, Frank. Military expert Frank Ledwidge in Oxford. Thank you so much.
Thank you.